in an age of blood, superstition, and soil survival, came down to what grew without help. No fertilizer, no science, just instinct, trial, and luck. Yet, in the forgotten corners of medieval Europe, farmers relied on plants that thrived where others withered. Some were medicine, some were food, some were hidden in church gardens. Today, they've nearly vanished, but once, they fed the poor, healed the sick, and held secrets modern science is only just beginning to rediscover. For most of the medieval period, the rhythm of survival depended almost entirely on the land, and the land was unforgiving. There were no chemical fertilizers, no mechanized tools, and for most peasants, not even basic manure was available in sufficient quantities. The average field was worn, nutrient-poor, and exposed to the elements year-round. Farming, in its most basic form, was a gamble with nature across much of Europe. The dominant system was known as open-field farming. Villages shared large expanses of land divided into long, narrow strips. Each family cultivated several strips scattered across different parts of the field. There were no fences, no enclosures. Livestock often grazed on communal meadows. Tools were rudimentary: wooden plows, hand scythes, and oxen-powered carts. The soil was turned not with precision, but with muscle and endurance. In the absence of scientific knowledge about nitrogen or phosphates, medieval farmers relied on crop rotation. One year grain, the next year legumes, followed by a fallow period. It was a system born of necessity, the only known method to delay soil exhaustion. Even then, yields were low. A typical farmer might sow 5 or 6 bushels of grain and harvest only 10 in return, sometimes less. The medieval diet, especially for the poor, reflected this scarcity. Bread made from coarse grains, porridge, cabbage, beans, and in better years, onions or leeks. Meat was rare, often limited to feast days. Malnutrition was common, and starvation was never far. A single failed harvest could send entire communities into collapse. Between 1315 and 1317, much of northern Europe experienced the Great Famine, a disaster caused not just by rain and cold, but by a food system with no margin for error. Adding to the hardship was the limited use of manure. In towns, human and animal waste was a growing nuisance. But on rural farms, it was often spread thin. Cattle and pigs were not just for milk or meat, they were walking storage for calories and future goods. Farmers couldn't afford to use them purely for fertilization. Animal waste was valuable, but rarely sufficient to rejuvenate large fields. So how did they endure? The answer lies partly in what they chose to grow. Medieval peasants didn't just plant what tasted good or looked appealing. They selected crops that could survive under brutal conditions: low rainfall, thin soil, minimal attention. Plants like rye, barley, oats, and certain root vegetables became staples not because they were preferred, but because they were reliable. Some species had adapted over centuries to poor soils. Others were discovered through trial and error. And many of these crops, once widespread, have faded into obscurity. The story of how they survived year after year, with so little to rely on, is not just about hardship. It's about a knowledge system built outside of science, passed down orally, refined by experience, and shaped by desperation. Before fertilizer, before even basic agronomy, there was only the soil, the weather, and the stubborn will to live. Across medieval Europe, survival depended less on invention than on memory. In a world with limited literacy and no formal science, the farmer's most powerful tool was accumulated knowledge, passed not through books, but through habit, ritual, and oral instruction. These were not scientists in the modern sense, but their relationship with the land was precise, intimate, and often more accurate than what later generations assumed. Field laborers, monastic gardeners, village herbalists, each preserved fragments of a collective system honed over centuries. They knew, often without understanding the chemical reasons, that certain crops grew best after others. Legumes, like peas and beans, weren't just food. They were planted to restore the soil. Farmers rotated their fields in complex patterns, often 3 or 4 plots at a time, not because of formal education, but because failure to do so had consequences. Failed harvests, hungry winters, or empty grains. Timing was everything. Without printed calendars or clocks, seasonal knowledge was tied to the movement of stars, the pattern of animal migrations, or the bloom of certain wildflowers. For instance, in parts of England, the flowering of hawthorn often marked the start of sowing oats. These signals served as natural timekeepers long before standardized dates. Monasteries became unexpected centers of agrarian preservation. In Benedictine and Cistercian orders, monks maintained elaborate gardens, not for beauty, but for utility. They recorded their work in herbals, handwritten manuscripts combining medicinal use, growing methods, and theological commentary. The Physica of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, catalogued dozens of plants with descriptions drawn from observation, scripture, and the medical theories of the time. These works blended practical advice with belief systems rooted in Christian doctrine and remnants of ancient Greek medicine. But outside the cloisters, much of this wisdom remained oral. Herbalists, often women, held detailed knowledge of healing plants, where to find them, when to harvest them, how to prepare them. Recipes and techniques were shared in person, often from mother to daughter, and rarely written down. This made the knowledge vulnerable when persecution swept through in later centuries, especially during witch hunts. Much of this female-led knowledge was suppressed or lost. Even so, the resilience of these systems is visible in what endured. Many of the drought-tolerant or soil-independent crops that fed medieval communities were chosen through trial and survival. They knew, for instance, that nettles, though painful to harvest, grew almost anywhere and could be eaten or used medicinally. They knew which plants regrew each year, which ones could endure frost, and which ones were best harvested before midday heat. There was no line separating agriculture from belief. Fields were often blessed. Harvest rituals blended with saints' days. Illness in crops might be blamed on divine punishment or demonic interference, but still, the farmer would adjust planting depth or spacing based on what had worked before. This forgotten layer of knowledge wasn't superstition alone. It was a system of empirical trial recorded not in ink, but in survival. And while it may seem primitive now, it kept families alive in a world without safety nets. Among the forgotten greens of medieval Europe, one plant stood out for its resilience, abundance, and importance in the diets of the poor, Chinapon. Bonus henricus, more commonly known as Good King Henry. Despite the regal name, it had nothing to do with monarchs. Instead, it was a wild perennial that grew freely in neglected corners of fields, near stables, along roadsides, and next to dung heaps. It asked for nothing, no fertilizer, no tilling, no irrigation. Yet year after year, it came back, feeding those who had little else. In a time when food insecurity was constant and cultivated vegetables were a seasonal luxury, Good King Henry was a dependable source of nutrition. The leaves were rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins, and could be harvested for much of the growing season. Young shoots were boiled and eaten like asparagus. Older leaves were used like spinach, often cooked down into thick pottages or added to stews made from barley or oats. In lean times, it helped stretch meals. In monastic gardens, it had a modest but functional place, used both as food and occasionally for medicinal purposes, particularly in poultices and laxatives. The plant's role was especially critical in regions where the soil was poor or frequently exhausted. Its deep taproot allowed it to draw nutrients from far below the surface, a trait that made it hardy even in overworked land. Unlike annual crops, it did not need to be replanted. Once established, it returned each spring, providing a level of food security rare for the medieval peasant class. This made it especially valuable in marginal environments, hilly pastures, alpine villages, and colder climates. Despite its utility, Good King Henry never crossed into the realm of cultivated prestige. It remained a poor man's food, associated with hunger, not abundance. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as commercial agriculture expanded and new varieties of spinach, cabbage, and lettuce became widely available, it began to vanish from both fields and kitchens. Its bitter taste, fibrous texture, and strong associations with poverty contributed to its decline. Even in rural communities, it was gradually abandoned, replaced by imported crops that required more care but offered higher yields and cleaner aesthetics. Its disappearance wasn't noted in botanical records with any sense of loss. It simply faded from view, dismissed as a weed or a relic of older, more desperate times. By the 20th century, it was nearly unknown outside of circles and a few isolated mountain communities. Only recently has Good King Henry seen limited revival, especially among heritage growers and permaculture advocates. Its hardiness, low maintenance, and nutritional density have sparked renewed interest. A few seed banks in Europe and North America have begun preserving it, and it occasionally appears in foraging guides or sustainability workshops. In parts of Germany, Switzerland, and Wales, smallholder farms have experimented with bringing it back, not as a staple, but as a symbol of agricultural resilience and forgotten knowledge. What was once dismissed as the food of peasants is now being re-examined for what it truly was: a self-sustaining, nutrient-dense crop that helped generations survive with nothing but land, patience, and tradition. Stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, is today more often cursed than cultivated. Brushed against carelessly, it leaves a sharp, burning rash on the skin. But in medieval Europe, this plant, now seen as a nuisance, was a vital part of daily survival. It thrived in depleted soil, needed no fertilizer, and grew abundantly near human settlements, often along hedgerows, fence lines, and dung heaps. Its sting, though unpleasant, marked the presence of a plant that was once both feared and valued in peasant communities from the British Isles to the Baltics. Nettles were a springtime staple. After long winters of dried grain and salted meats, fresh greens were rare and essential. Nettles, among the first plants to emerge after the frost, were harvested young before the stinging hairs matured fully. Boiled or soaked, the sting disappeared, and the leaves were added to broths, porridges, and simple stews. Rich in iron, calcium, and vitamin C, nettles helped combat malnutrition and seasonal deficiencies, especially scurvy. Beyond food, nettles were a cornerstone of folk medicine. Documented in texts as early as the 10th century, They appear in the Laknanga, an Old English medical manuscript, as treatment for joint pain, nosebleeds, and digestive issues. Physicians like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century and later. Herbalists such as Nicholas Culpeper in the 17th century described nettles as warming and drying, properties thought to balance bodily humors. Nettles were used to treat arthritis, bladder infections, and to stimulate circulation. In some traditions, fresh nettles were deliberately applied to the skin to provoke inflammation, a practice known as urtication, believed to relieve deeper pain, particularly in cases of rheumatism. Even clothing was drawn from this source. Long before cotton became widespread in northern Europe, nettle fibers were extracted from mature stalks and spun into thread. Though coarse compared to flax or wool, nettle fabric was durable and insulating. In regions like Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe, nettle-based textiles were produced throughout the medieval period. Archaeological findings, including 2,800-year-old nettle fabric discovered in Denmark, confirm its long-standing utility. Monasteries, which served as centers of both medical knowledge and agricultural experimentation, cultivated nettles intentionally. Monks used them in poultices, teas, and as part of healing baths. In some abbeys, nettle patches were allowed to grow undisturbed, not because they were overlooked, but because their usefulness was understood. The decline of nettle's prominence came with agricultural modernization. As textile industries industrialized and imported materials became affordable, nettle fabric was phased out. Likewise, as vegetables became easier to store and transport, the need for wild spring greens diminished. By the 19th and 20th centuries, nettles were largely relegated to weeds, unwanted, unmanaged, and misunderstood. But in the centuries before, nettle was survival, uninviting on the surface, but sustaining beneath. Its return, in some modern herbalist circles and permaculture farms, is not innovation, but recognition of what medieval communities already knew, that even the painful parts of the landscape had their purpose. Chenopodium album, commonly known as fat hen, was never considered elegant. It wasn't cultivated in royal gardens or traded across merchant routes. Yet for centuries, it fed those left behind by war, poverty, and neglect. Fat hen grew where little else could, in disturbed, compacted, or nutrient-poor soil. It thrived on field edges, along roadsides, and in the waste grounds of medieval villages. It didn't require planting, fertilizing, or care. It simply appeared, and for the poor, it was often the difference between hunger and survival. Its history goes back well before the medieval era. Archaeological finds from Iron Age settlements in Britain and Northern Europe have revealed charred seeds of Chenopodium album stored alongside grains. It was a weed, but a useful one, high in protein, calcium, iron, and vitamins A and C. During times of scarcity, it was collected by hand, cooked like spinach, or dried and powdered for winter. The seeds, though small, were occasionally ground into flour or added to gruels by the Middle Ages. Fat hen was widely known across Europe. It appeared in early herbals, often listed not as a cultivated crop, but as a pot herb, a plant suitable for boiling in the large cauldrons common to peasant kitchens. Its use increased dramatically during periods of crisis. When harvests failed or wars swept through the countryside, access to grains and vegetables collapsed. In these moments, fat hen, ignored in good years, became essential. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by prolonged rains and crop failures, wild greens like fat hen were foraged in vast quantities across northern Europe. Chroniclers described how the poor resorted to anything edible, and plants like Chenopodium album became a lifeline. In wartime, it re-emerged again. In France during the 100 Years' War, and later in Germany during the 30 Years' War, soldiers and civilians alike turned to such overlooked species as supply lines, broke down and fields were destroyed. But it was never adopted by the elite. The upper classes considered fat hen a weed, a symbol of poor management and unclean land. Its lack of prestige meant it was never intentionally bred or refined. Unlike cabbage, lettuce, or chard, it remained wild, unchanged, and culturally invisible. Its decline accelerated during the agricultural reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries. As crop rotation improved, fertilizers became available, and imported vegetables gained ground. Reliance on wild greens faded. Fat hen, once essential, was removed from cultivated fields and suppressed in favor of clean farmland. By the time industrial agriculture took hold, it was no longer seen as a food source, but as an intruder. Today, Chenopodium album is classified as a common weed in much of Europe and North America. But in ecological and historical circles, its role as a famine, food, and survival crop is being re-examined. It represents a chapter of history in which the overlooked plants that needed no care and offered no status became tools of endurance in a world where failure meant starvation. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, grew without invitation. It lined the footpaths of medieval Europe, filled ditches and hedgerows, and crept along the edges of cultivated fields. Its resilience required no tending. Its presence, however, was never ignored. In pre-Christian Europe, mugwort held a reputation, both practical and spiritual. Among the Anglo-Saxons, it was one of the most sacred of the so-called 9 herbs charm, a medicinal incantation preserved in a 10th-century-old English manuscript. There, it was described as the oldest of herbs, said to drive out poison, infection, and evil. The charm wasn't a poetic flourish. It reflected actual practice. Mugwort was commonly boiled into teas, used as a poultice, or burned as incense. It was believed to relieve stomach disorders, ease menstruation, and calm the nerves. Its association with dreams was widespread. In both Germanic and Celtic traditions, mugwort was believed to open the mind to visions during sleep. Leaves were placed beneath pillows or sewn into pouches worn at night. Some texts from the early medieval period link mugwort to so-called second sight, suggesting it was used by seers or herbalists during ritual preparation. These beliefs endured well into the Christian era, particularly in rural areas where folk traditions remained strong. But mugwort's uses extended beyond mysticism. It was valued in food preservation and cooking. In a time before refrigeration, herbs were critical in preventing spoilage. Mugwort's bitterness helped mask the taste of aging meats and was sometimes used in place of hops in early beer production. Monasteries in the Carolingian and later medieval periods cultivated mugwort in their horti simplicium, herb gardens devoted to medicinal and culinary plants. Its inclusion in Benedictine manuals confirms its value in structured religious medical practice, even as older pagan associations lingered quietly beneath the surface. In Slavic cultures, mugwort was used in seasonal festivals and rites of protection. On the feast of Ivan Kapala, wreaths of mugwort were worn or burned in ceremonial fires. In parts of Scandinavia and the Baltic, branches were hung over doorways to ward off illness and malevolent spirits. These rituals were often tolerated by local clergy, as long as they were not directly framed in opposition to Christian teaching, a pattern that allowed mugwort's spiritual role to continue in rural Europe through the late Middle Ages. By the 16th century, the medical literature began to shift. With the rise of academic herbals, such as those written by German botanist Leonhard Fuchs and later English physicians like John Gerard, mugwort's profile declined. It was still recognized, but now it competed with imported herbs and newer pharmacological theories rooted in humoral science. The rise of regulated apothecaries and the decline of folk medicine pushed mugwort to the margins. Its role in dreams, visions, and seasonal rituals slowly vanished from mainstream knowledge. Today, mugwort is seen by most as an aggressive weed. Yet for centuries, it played a vital role in the intersection of healing, survival, and belief. It was a plant that nourished bodies and shaped the unseen rituals of pre-modern life. From monastery walls to midsummer fires, lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album, is often confused with fat hen, and for good reason. Both belonged to the same genus. Both grew uninvited across medieval Europe, and both were essential to the survival of people living close to the edge of subsistence. But while fat hen was more often used for its seeds, lamb's quarters became a staple green, nutritious, abundant, and self-seeding. It was collected regularly by peasants, especially in spring and early summer, when food stores ran low and fresh vegetables were still scarce. The plant thrived across a wide range of environments. It tolerated poor soil, drought, and trampling. It was found near dung heaps, along village footpaths, and between rows of cultivated crops, often removed by landowners, but left alone in fields worked by tenants and laborers. Unlike wheat or barley, lamb's quarters needed no attention. It sprouted after the first rains and, once identified, was gathered by hand. The young leaves were especially prized. Cooked like spinach, they were added to pottages and gruels, or boiled down and eaten with coarse bread. In regions where dairy was available, they were sometimes added to cheese-based dishes. Nutritionally, lamb's quarters rivaled and in some cases exceeded many cultivated greens. It was high in protein, calcium, iron, and essential vitamins, particularly vitamin A and C. Its seeds, though smaller than modern quinoa, shared a similar profile. In fact, modern genetic studies have confirmed that Chenopodium album is a close cousin to Chenopodium quinoa, the Andean plant now marketed globally as a soup. But where quinoa was cultivated and protected, lamb's quarters were ignored, first by aristocrats, then by reformers, and eventually by industrial agriculture. Its disappearance was not immediate. Lamb's quarters continued to appear in rural diets well into the early modern period. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was still included in cookbooks and herbal manuals, though increasingly framed as country fare or common food. As wealth spread and urbanization increased, diets changed. Cultivated vegetables, especially those with mild flavors and longer shelf lives, began to dominate markets. Spinach, cabbage, and lettuce took precedence. By the 19th century, lamb's quarters had been removed deliberately from commercial fields, labeled a weed in agronomic guides, and slowly erased from public memory. Today, lamb's quarters are rarely recognized outside of foraging circles, despite their nutritional value. In ecological terms, they remain one of the most successful opportunistic plants in temperate regions. In historical terms, they stand as a reminder of how forgotten foods once sustained entire populations, not because they were fashionable or profitable, but because they were there, growing where nothing else would. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, was not planted in orderly garden beds. It emerged on dry hillsides, among stones, along roadsides, and in the ruins of past battles. Its presence was familiar to soldiers and villagers alike. In medieval Europe, it was known by many names: nosebleed plant, woundwort, herbal, militaries, each hinting at its long-standing role in treating injuries. While rarely mentioned in royal inventories, it was a staple in the kits of battlefield surgeons and rural healers. Passed from one generation to the next with little ceremony but lasting impact, the association between yarrow and warfare was. Ancient Roman accounts credited Achilles with carrying it into battle to treat his wounded men, a connection that earned the plant its Latin name. That symbolism endured across centuries. In medieval campaigns, whether during the Norman conquests, the 100 Years' War, or internal feuds between lords, yarrow was gathered quickly in the wake of combat. When tools were few and bleeding was fatal, yarrow's astringent properties made it one of the most dependable field remedies. Crushed and packed into open wounds, it helped stop bleeding. When brewed, it served to ease fever or inflammation. In some cases, it was chewed before battle to steady the nerves. In local medicine, yarrow was equally indispensable. Medical manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries reference it regularly. The Herbarium Apilae, a Latin text translated into Old English, includes yarrow among its core healing plants. Monastic herbals, such as those kept by the Benedictines at Monte Cassino or the Cistercians at Clairvaux, describe its uses clearly: poultices for cuts, infusions for fevers, even as a remedy for toothaches. Its leaves were known to knit skin and reduce inflammation. Its flowers, when dried, were used in tinctures and compresses. Yarrow's value wasn't limited to its chemistry. In Northern and Eastern European traditions, it held symbolic weight. It was used in protective charms, midsummer rituals, and burial rites. In parts of Scandinavia and the Baltic, it was believed to guard against death in battle. Soldiers carried it not only for treatment, but for protection. The belief wasn't tied to magic alone. It reflected the reality that in times when survival depended on simple tools, yarrow was often the most reliable weapon against infection. Its adaptability made it even more valuable. Yarrow tolerated drought, wind, and poor soil. It grew where cultivated herbs could not. During sieges or famines, when access to supplies broke down, it could be gathered near fortresses or along the very roads soldiers had marched down. It remained part of folk medicine long after more sophisticated treatments emerged, and even into the early 20th century, it appeared in rural field guides and army manuals as an emergency wound dressing. Today, yarrow grows largely unnoticed. Its role in medieval healing is rarely taught, but its legacy is embedded in centuries of conflict and care, from scorched fields of war to the herbal tables of village healers. It was not a miracle plant, but a dependable one, and in medieval life that made all the difference. Plantain, Plantago major, was not grown in gardens or recorded in inventories of wealth, but it followed people wherever they went. It emerged in the cracks of stone paths, beside thatched cottages, along worn cart tracks, and around the edges of village fields. In medieval Europe, it required no cultivation, no fertilizer, no care. It spread quickly and silently off, trampled but never eradicated. It earned its reputation through endurance and utility. Long before formal medicine reached rural settlements, plantain served as one of the most dependable treatments for wounds, bites, and infections. The leaves were broad, ribbed, and slightly sticky. When crushed, they released a cooling sap that soothed skin and helped stop bleeding. They were packed directly onto open cuts, insect stings, and boils. In areas without access to apothecaries or trained physicians, this humble plant was often the first and, sometimes only line of defense against infection. Its use was documented in the Laknanga, a 10th century collection of Old English medical texts blending pagan and Christian traditions. There, plantain is called wegbraid and described in incantations and herbal preparations. The Herbarium Apelli, another early text, recommends it for fevers, urinary problems, and wounds. By the 12th century, monastic herbalists had incorporated plantain into their compendiums. Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess and polymath, described it as warming and drying, in line with the humoral theory of the time. Its ability to draw out toxins was prized. When crushed and bound with cloth, it was said to reduce swelling and prevent festering in infected injuries. Culturally, plantain became associated with travel and migration. It spread aggressively across paths and roads, aided by the movement of people and animals. In later centuries, Native American tribes in North America reportedly called it white man's footprint, observing that it appeared wherever European settlers passed. This nickname, though from a later era, reflected a truth medieval Europeans had long understood. Plantain thrived where people did. It adapted to disturbance, to compacted soil, to the margins of civilization. Unlike cultivated herbs, plantain was accessible to all. It didn't require knowledge to identify or tools to harvest. It grew where life was hardest, in places of foot traffic, injury, and labor. Its decline wasn't due to failure, but neglect. As formal medicine advanced, as pharmacies replaced field remedies, and as modern agriculture reclassified plantain as a weed, its role faded. Yet, it never disappeared. Even today, it can be found along paths and in neglected plots, still carrying the same properties that made it invaluable to medieval communities. In a world where wounds were common and antiseptics unknown, plantain served a simple function. It healed. Quietly and effectively, it earned its place in the survival strategies of those who had little else. Its presence was not a sign of wealth or sophistication, but of adaptation, endurance, and the wisdom embedded in the ordinary. Chicory, Sicarium intybus, was never meant to impress. Its blue flowers appeared along roadsides and in fallow fields, far from the manicured plots of noble estates. But in the world of medieval Europe, where survival required adaptability, chicory became a plant of unusual versatility. It grew in hard-packed rocky soils, often where other crops failed. It tolerated drought. It needed no fertilization, and it offered both food and function in a society where those categories were often inseparable. By the 9th century, chicory had a firm place in monastic horticulture. Under Charlemagne the Capitulaire de Villiers, a royal decree that listed essential plants to be cultivated on imperial estates included chicory among the medicinal herbs to be grown in gardens overseen by monks. These were not ornamental gardens. They were spaces of experimentation, healing, and utility. Chicory's leaves, when young, were added to simple dishes, boiled greens, potages, and vinegar-soaked salads. Bitter in taste, but rich in minerals. It provided a welcome contrast to the bland, starch-heavy staples of the peasant diet. Its root, however, held a different role. When dried, ground, and steeped, it produced a dark, bitter liquid, long used in medicinal contexts to aid digestion. and cleanse the liver. In medical texts from the High Middle Ages, including works attributed to Hildegard of Bingen and the Tarquinium Sanctitas, chicory appeared regularly as a cooling herb believed to balance the humors. It was considered especially useful for conditions linked to bile and melancholy. Physicians prescribed it for stomach ailments, fever, and even insomnia. What made chicory distinctive was its position between medicine and sustenance. It blurred categories. In rural communities, it was both a weed and a remedy. In urban centers, it became a component in bitters and tonics. And in monasteries, it was cultivated not for taste alone, but for its perceived therapeutic value. Its role shifted during periods of scarcity. By the 17th century, long after the medieval period had ended, chicory began appearing in new contexts. During coffee shortages, particularly in France and parts of Central Europe, chicory root was roasted and used as a substitute. The practice spread during the Napoleonic Wars, when blockades disrupted access to colonial imports. Chicory offered a local, reliable alternative. It mimicked the bitterness of coffee, but was grown in European soil, not overseas plantations. Ironically, the very elites who once dismissed chicory as a poor man's herb came to consume it unknowingly in their beverages. Merchants and manufacturers blended it into coffee stocks to stretch supplies and reduce costs, sometimes as an adulterant, sometimes by necessity. The root that fooled the rich didn't just persist, it adapted, just as it always had, to the changing priorities of the society around it. Today, chicory is often forgotten or reduced to a dietary curiosity, but for centuries, it held an important place in the quiet infrastructure of survival, grown by monks, gathered by peasants, prescribed by healers, and consumed by those who never knew its name. A plant that never needed attention, only recognition. The plants that once sustained medieval villages are now considered weeds. Their disappearance wasn't the result of a sudden shift, but a slow process shaped by industrialization, economic change, and evolving ideas of food and value. Beginning in the 18th century, Europe's agricultural landscape transformed. Scientific farming took hold. New methods emphasized yield over resilience, uniformity over diversity. Crops that had once survived on poor soils without intervention were pushed aside in favor of those that responded well to chemical inputs. By the mid-19th century, commercial fertilizers, particularly superphosphatics and later synthetic nitrogen, became standard. With them came a new expectation that land must produce more, faster. This marked a turning point. Hardy plants, like lamb's quarters, fat hen, and nettle no longer fit within the goals of productivity or market efficiency. They were unpredictable, often variable in size and appearance, and lacked commercial appeal. More importantly, they didn't need fertilizer. And in a farming economy increasingly tied to the sale and use of chemical inputs, that made them undesirable. As commercial agriculture expanded, so did the aesthetic expectations of food. Supermarkets and emerging global markets favored uniformity of standard size, shape, and color. Crops that naturally varied or grew wild were seen as untidy or backward. This visual standard, paired with changing tastes and class perceptions, effectively erased many traditional plants from both fields and memory. By the 20th century, these once crucial crops had been systematically excluded from seed catalogs, farming manuals, and culinary education. In their place came export-friendly monocultures, high-yield grains, hybrid vegetables, and heavily irrigated fruits. The knowledge of how to use wild plants faded with each generation, often surviving only in oral histories or isolated rural communities today. Some researchers are working to reverse that loss. British botanist Dr. Trevor Dines notes that many of these so-called weeds are far more resilient to climate stress than most cultivated crops. Ethnobotanist Gary Nabhan describes them as forgotten allies, capable of thriving without fossil fuel-based inputs. Across Europe, small groups of agronomists and food historians are cataloguing these plants before their traits disappear entirely. Their findings challenge long-held assumptions. Studies now show that nettles contain more protein than spinach, that fat hen seeds rival quinoa in nutrition, and that plants like Good King Henry offer perennial food with no need for replanting. These forgotten crops are not simply remnants of a poorer past. They represent systems of food production that required fewer resources, relied on local knowledge, and adapted to hardship. In the face of climate instability and rising food insecurity, the question is no longer why these plants were abandoned, but whether it was ever wise to forget them. In the 21st century, food systems once thought to be advanced are revealing deep vulnerabilities. Industrial agriculture, designed for scale and speed, now struggles with rising temperatures, soil depletion, and water scarcity. Monocultures collapse under drought and disease. Fertilizer costs surge with fossil fuel markets. In this unstable environment, researchers, farmers, and policymakers are turning their attention to plants that had once been pushed aside, species that medieval farmers relied on not for profit, but for endurance. These plants, nettles, fat hen, Good King Henry, yarrow, lamb's quarters, survived without irrigation, chemical treatment, or global supply chains. They grew in degraded soils. They tolerated cold, dry, and erratic seasons. They produced reliable nutrition even under the most difficult conditions. What had once been dismissed as primitive or poor is now being studied for its resilience. Projects in the UK, Germany, and parts of Scandinavia are reintroducing these species through seed banks and regenerative agriculture initiatives. In France, ethnobotanists are cataloguing wild edible species once used during the war years. In parts of Eastern Europe, farmers are returning to polyculture systems that mirror medieval methods, incorporating hardy, underutilized plants to rebuild soil structure and reduce dependency on synthetic inputs. The Land Institute in Kansas and the European Center for Environmental Research have both cited these species as potential models for climate-adaptive cropping. What's being recovered isn't just biodiversity, but an older kind of agricultural knowledge, one that valued stability over output, variety over uniformity. The medieval peasant, working with limited land and no margin for error, understood that food security depended not on abundance, but on persistence. Every plant in their field served a purpose. Each one contributed to survival. These crops are not relics, they are models, not of nostalgia, but of adaptation. They remind us that food systems weren't always global, synthetic, or brittle, and that, in a warming world, the solutions may come not from innovation alone, but from memory.